The service agency that I talked to for trafficking victims in Minnesota was the Booth Brown House, which is also connected to Streetworks. The administrator that I had an appointment with was James Scott. Their organization serves youth from the ages of 14 to 24. The difference between the two is that Streetworks has outreach personnel that will go out in the community and find homeless youth out on public transportation, sleeping in the streets, and they will provide supply bags with immediate first aid supplies and food, whereas Booth Brown is strictly a shelter, and the outreach personnel can refer people to the shelter. What they can provide are hygiene products, meals, food shelf connections, clothing, drop-in centers for laundry, clothing vouchers, clothing shelves, and some of which can suffice for job interviews, and longer-term services. Victims can find these agencies through schools, other victim referrals, so basically peer groups who've already been through it. They make a point to get their name out to social workers so that they can point them out to clients. However, some shelters are only for minors or just exploited people in general, so they can be limiting in that way. There is an mn.org app through the Youth Service Network that people can use to be able to find them. However, not everybody knows about the app. There are medical centers that can refer them, and the outreach workers can find people, and then sometimes employers can even refer them. Some of the barriers that the victims face include the fact that it is a very complex system, so it's time consuming. It can often take 4 to 6 months for a person to be placed into housing. That's partially because there is a housing market that's quite predatory, and that leads to the struggle of mobility and not having a real sense of permanency. There are dynamics based off of a person's vulnerability and then those that can take advantage of them. As a result, there is a lot of fear and distrust of authority figures or even of those who try to show generosity. And as a result, the outreach workers and all the managers have to really earn the client's trust because of that prior hurt, that prior trauma. They have to really build up their reputation. These systems oftentimes neglect men and are aimed at women, particularly those that have kids. There are systematic barriers that lead to homelessness. Sometimes the victims don't feel safe being able to ask for help. There are county financial services that are very difficult to go through. The women are oftentimes not believed by cops, the very people who are supposed to help them and get justice for them. There is a financial reality of poverty for them. Services are often aimed at the nuclear family. So if somebody falls outside of the idea of a nuclear family, maybe they are single, maybe they don't have any other relatives, maybe they've completely lost all of their relatives, that can be a huge psychological barrier for them. There are also pretty stringent eligibility requirements. Over 90% of exploiters are white males, and all of them target kids. There are now fewer and fewer places for people to be able to go. Services that this agency and its victims wish could be provided for them are that other agencies don't always provide housing. Some don't really provide a sense of safety in terms of the offender being able to find them, or they might not be welcoming to LGBT youth. There might be a lot of discrimination there. They really need the right opportunities for employment, education. No single agency really can provide everything. They need connections with the right kinds of services that fit them at that point in their lives. The capacity for these places is often not enough, and there is a neglect about mental health resources. However, they are doing better than most other agencies, but they still need to focus on having culturally appropriate services and trauma-informed care. Their annual budget is just shy over $1 million. They get their funding from county, state, and federal contracts, donors, the Department of Homeland Security gives grants, HUD gives housing and urban development assistance. There's Ramsey County suburban agencies and the PIAHD, which owns the Twins. Their annual budget is used for contracts with their partners for the outreach workers, so most of the budget just passes through. In terms of competition with other agencies, it's still really amicable. There isn't any animosity there. However, in terms of competition, sometimes they have to compete against other branches of the same organization. Therefore, they do technically and practically compete for funding, and some of it has to be shared between two or more agencies, but there's still that sense of collaboration. Some agencies are more competitive than others, but it is more about building relationship with other workers. An entry-level worker can expect to make between $13 and $18 an hour depending on the agency and their experience. It's still not enough. However, there's also a gap between practical application and practice. For example, he noticed that students who are fresh out of school going into the field might be able to have all the book smarts, but they don't really know how to actually use that in order to have culturally appropriate practices to enable the victims to trust them. Some miscellaneous information is that the shelter has 2 managers, 3 administrators. The name of the landlord is Booth Brown. Their rent is $300 a month per their office. As I walked through the building, I noticed that one hallway had a very medical feel about it because of the particular lighting, the structure of the door frames, the way the rooms were laid out. And that actually makes sense because it had once been a hospital for unwed mothers. The building was first made 12 years ago, and it had been a shelter as of 7 years ago. I was led through the supply closet, and I noticed they had menstrual products, condoms, lube, toothpaste, toothbrush, just everything you can imagine.